Welcome to the City of Penticton's Community Energy Emissions Plan 2021 update. This is a public engagement video to provide the public with information to assist them with filling out the public information survey. We would like to get your feedback on the proposed Community Energy Emissions Plan. My name is Peter Robinson. I work for the Community Energy Association, and I've been working on developing this plan in collaboration with some of my colleagues and also with staff in the City of Penticton and stakeholders. We're looking forward to getting your feedback. First of all, we'd like to start with some background information for your benefit. What is a Community Energy Emissions Plan? A Community Energy Emissions Plan, or CEEP for short, is a plan to leverage local government powers to save residents and businesses energy, emissions, and money. It can be one part of broader local government climate action, which can also include an adaptation plan or a corporate energy and emissions plan, which we're also working on for the City of Penticton. What is in the City of Penticton's toolbox with respect to community energy emissions planning? Well, the city has tools in infrastructure, in policy and regulation, and in engagement and collaboration. Broadly speaking, we can think about these tools as enabling choice, shaping choice, and supporting choice for residents and businesses within the community in terms of reducing energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. There are multiple benefits to a climate action plan. Some of these benefits are they help the city to meet legislative requirements for greenhouse gas targets. All communities in BC, as a result of provincial legislation, have been required for many years now to have greenhouse gas emission reduction targets in their official community plans in order to work towards reducing community greenhouse gas emissions. It can also help a community meet its requirements under the Climate Action Charter, and the vast majority of communities in BC have signed this. It can also help a community find funding as well, because there are more and more sources of funding that are tied to climate action. As you can see in the diagram to the right there are many benefits to implementing a community energy emissions plan, and many of these are extremely straightforward. So some examples are enhancing green spaces within the community or increasing tree cover. On the social side of things, we can look at things, so for example, supporting aging in place by increasing the availability of transportation options within the community, or social equity by working to reduce people's energy bills. On the economic side of things, if we save people's money with respect to reducing their energy bills, that can help from the perspective of economic development and job creation and recirculating savings in the local economy. These are just a few of the co-benefits that climate action can bring to a community. The City of Penticton is one of these many communities in BC, the vast majority of communities in BC, that has signed the BC Climate Action Charter. This charter committed the city to become carbon neutral in its corporate operations, to measure and report on its corporate greenhouse gas emissions every year, and to work on creating a complete, compact, and more energy efficient community. So working on a community energy emissions plan helps the city to meet these goals. And the city had an old community greenhouse gas target of 5% reduction by 2020 and also 10% reduction by 2030, both below 2007 levels. It looks like, based on the information we've gathered over the course of this project, that the 2020 target is unlikely to be met, but there is still a chance for the 2030 target. The City of Penticton has done a lot of work on climate action and on environmental protection up to date, and so a brief snapshot of this is contained in this slide. In the new official community plan, updated policies around climate action and environmental protection were contained. The city has a drought management plan, which helps it to adapt to changing climate conditions, which we're already seeing in the city. The city's utility has established a home energy loan program to help people with energy efficiency projects in their homes, and has also established a net metering program for solar. With respect to new buildings, the city has implemented the BC Energy Step Code for Step 1 and then moving on to Step 3, and in fact was the first community in the Okanagan to implement this. The city has an Adopt a Park program. The city has curbside recycling and yard waste audits. The city has hired a community sustainability coordinator. A power generation study has been completed, looking at renewable energy options. The city has supported BC Transit for expanding routes, and the city now already has 2 hybrid vehicles in its vehicle fleet. The city's work on climate action will not occur in a vacuum. There's also support at the federal and provincial levels. Federally, there is the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change. Provincially, there is the Clean BC Plan. If we look in detail at the Clean BC Plan, there's a lot of very interesting things in here from the city's perspective and what it can do on climate change. So starting already that we have seen increasing investments in, for example, heat pumps and insulation for homes, and we've also seen the Greener Homes Grant. We've seen the introduction of changes to the BC Building Code, where all new buildings in BC are going to need to be at least 20% more efficient than they currently are being built, starting in 2022, and that's going to ramp up to 80%, 50 to 80% by 2032. For existing buildings, we should see a retrofit code that should start from 2024. With respect to vehicles, we are going to see an increasing number of electric vehicles on the road, and the province is requiring that 10% of all new vehicles on the road, light-duty vehicles, from 2025 will need to be zero emissions, going up to 40% by 2030, and even 100% by 2040. And actually recently, it looks like this is being superseded by a federal target that all new light-duty vehicles sold in Canada will need to be zero emissions starting from 2035. From 2030, about 15% of natural gas in the natural gas network should need to be renewable, and also 95% of organics will need to be diverted from landfill as well. This gives an excellent sense of some of the climate action initiatives. What kind of a vision of a low-carbon future can a community work towards? Well, this slide gives a sense of that. So when thinking about our community and a low-carbon future, we can think about things like the way we move, where we live and work, and what we do with our waste. And so, in other words, by 2050, we'll need to have zero-emission transportation, zero-emission buildings, and we'll need to close the loop on waste. Zero-emission transportation can mean a complete zero-emission transportation system that connects our communities and regions. With respect to buildings, it can mean that our communities' buildings are exceptionally energy efficient and powered, heated, and cooled with 100% renewable energy. And with respect to waste, it can mean that our communities divert all of our organics and recover as much value as they can from our waste streams. Okay, now let's look in some more detail at the City of Penticton's community greenhouse gas emissions inventory and also our business as usual projections. This slide shows the City of Penticton's community greenhouse gas emissions for the 2018 inventory year, and it's split by gasoline vehicles, diesel vehicles, residential buildings, CSMI buildings, which means commercial and small medium industrial buildings, and also waste. And it splits these things by energy consumption, which is denoted by gigajoules or GJs, tons of CO2 equivalent, which is, in other words, greenhouse gas emissions, and also estimated energy expenditures shown by EST.dollar, estimated dollars spent. So you can see that gasoline vehicles are responsible for more greenhouse gas emissions than any other part of the inventory, and also for more energy expenditures as well. Residential buildings and CSMI buildings are also responsible for fairly substantial amounts of greenhouse gas emissions and estimated energy expenditures. Waste, of course, there's no energy associated with waste from this perspective in terms of consumption, and obviously we're not buying electricity or buying natural gas for waste, so there's no estimated energy expenditures, so it just shows up with respect to tons of CO2 equivalent. But you can see that waste is also a fairly substantial source of emissions. It cannot be neglected. So overall, the city's 2018 emissions came to around 238,300 tons of CO2 equivalent, and the city's estimated energy expenditures came to about $135.6 million. Estimated energy expenditures, or the community energy spend, is one of the most interesting places for community to look at when it starts to think about community energy emissions planning. And this is because this money is basically, a lot of this money, not all of it, but a lot of it, is basically being exported from the community. So every year, more or less, about $135 million, and obviously this changes based on how much energy people use, on what energy prices are doing, but about $135 million are leaving the community. If we can try to keep more of this money local, either by helping people to use less, or by generating more energy locally, then obviously that can be good for people's pockets, for households, for families, and for local economic development. How does this $135.6 million split? Well, in 2018, we think it split more or less as shown in this pie chart. About half of that was spent on mobility fuels, on moving our vehicles around roads, about $68 million. This slide shows the business as usual projection and the target, and in fact also shows inventory years from 2007 through to 2018. So if we look at 2007 to 2018, you can see how the community's greenhouse gas emissions have fluctuated because we've put all those inventory years into this chart. There is a bit of a dip as a result of a number of things. The city and regional district did some measures to reduce emissions from waste, and so that had a positive impact. But there was also fluctuations in the use of energy in gasoline and diesel vehicles over those years as well. And because of increased economic activity and also an increased population, this has been growing in some recent years and hence has made it more difficult for us to meet the targets, which are also shown on this chart. The light green or blue line shows the OCP target, the old OCP target that I mentioned earlier, and shows how it's very unlikely that we're going to hit the 2020 target, but there is still a chance to hit the 2030 target. So going forward from 2018, this chart shows business as usual projections. And so we take into account a number of different things with the business as usual projections. We take into account provincial and federal initiatives, such as the Zero Emission Vehicle Act that the province of BC passed, that requires all new light-duty vehicles to be zero emissions, starting from 2035, and will ramp up towards that date. And we think this is going to have a really substantial impact to the emissions to gasoline vehicles, even if the city doesn't have a community energy emissions plan at all. And you can see the impact that has on the chart. We take into account a number of different things in calculating the business as usual projections. Another thing we take into account is warmer winters, which mean that each home is actually going to probably need, on balance, on average, less natural gas each year, slightly less, in order to heat its home through the winter. On this chart, we've also shown the 1.5C target, and I'll be explaining a bit more what that is later in this presentation. So now we're going to be talking more about these greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. So to give a snapshot of targets, the current official community plan target for the city of Penticton, as I mentioned before, is a 5% reduction by 2020 and a 10% reduction by 2030. The provincial target is about an 80% reduction from 2007 levels by 2050, and most communities in BC currently follow this provincial target, along with some interim targets too. The federal target is a 30% reduction from 2005 levels by 2030 and has a plan to work towards net zero emissions by 2050. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, in its Global 1.5C Target Report, recommends that if we're going to keep the world to 1.5C degrees temperature change, which is what is considered to be manageable for our civilization and society as we know it, then 45% reduction from 2010 levels by 2030 is deemed necessary, and 100% reduction by 2050. And that is in fact the recommendation that we're making through this plan, and was the red line on the previous chart. So as you can see, the recommendation we're making for the city of Penticton for its local target is to reduce its community greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050, and to also have interim targets in this community energy emissions plan and also other documents. We also recommend using the 2007 year as a baseline, like the province and most other communities. We've received feedback on this in the stakeholder workshops, positive feedback, but we'd also like to hear from the public with respect to this, and this will be some of the questions in the survey. The interim targets we're recommending can be pragmatic targets. So what is a pragmatic target? That's a focus in the short term, on the next 5 to 10 years. It's produced based on modeling, and it's based on what we think the city can actually really do with its current resources, its current levers, and current technologies. What do we mean by current levers and current technologies? Well, the current framework in which the city operates in terms of its legislative ability, the legislation, the powers that it has from the province of BC, and the current technological framework, you know, that certain things are possible right now and certain things are currently not possible or have very poor business cases. So we base it on what we think is realistic in the short term. And then this pragmatic target can be developed as part of this community energy emissions planning process. So what kind of actions can the city of Penticton really do? we like to help communities to focus on what we call the big moves. The big moves split into those three categories that I mentioned earlier: transportation, buildings, and waste. So the big moves for transportation, there are three of them, are shifting beyond the car, in other words, encouraging active and assisted transportation and transit, electrifying passenger transportation, accelerating the adoption of zero-emission vehicles, and decarbonizing commercial transportation, supporting low-carbon options for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. For buildings, the two big moves are stepping up with new buildings, using the BC Energy Step Code, enhancing energy efficiency and low-carbon heating systems in new buildings, and decarbonizing existing buildings, supporting deep energy retrofits and fuel switching. And with respect to waste, there's one big move, which is closing the loop on waste, diverting organics and capturing value from waste. So for transportation, the 2050 vision is a complete zero-emission transportation system that connects our communities and regions, and does this by shifting beyond the car, by helping people out of single-occupant vehicles onto things like public transit, onto active transportation, bicycles, and walking. Also, what remaining single-occupant vehicles need to drive around are electrified or zero emissions. So electrifying passenger transportation, electrifying or turning those remaining vehicles into zero-emission vehicles. And finally, we can't forget commercial transportation. So doing what we can to decarbonize commercial transportation. Currently, this is an extremely difficult area to work in. There's limited solutions and levers available, but this is going to be an emerging area in the future. For buildings, the 2050 vision is that our community's buildings are exceptionally energy efficient and powered, heated, and cooled with 100% renewable energy. They should also be resilient with respect to a changing climate, for example, with respect to the hot summers that we're seeing now. So we need to decarbonize our existing buildings, and the city can work with for example, the city's electrical utility in order to work on a decarbonization project. And in dealing with waste, with closing the loop on waste, our 2050 vision is that the community diverts all of its organic waste, such as food scraps and garden trimmings, from landfills, and recovers value from everything that enters the waste stream, wherever possible. There are some other big moves that can't be forgotten. Organizational, for example. So this is like ways that the City of Penticton can organize itself in order to be most effective with respect to climate change. Examples of this include just making sure there's enough capacity to work on climate action projects. The city can also work on preventing deforestation within its community, or can also work on compensating in some way for deforestation that must occur. It can also work on expanding the urban tree canopy. The city can work on local food production, and of course already has an excellent farmers market, where farmers from the surrounding area are able to sell their food. The city can look at nature-based solutions, or look at options that have net negative emissions. And the city always needs to take into account the changing climate. So it needs to take into account adaptation or low carbon resilience. Finally, we'd like to say thank you for listening to this short informational video. We hope you have found it to be informative and that it's answered many of your questions. So please click on the link and complete the survey, and we look forward to seeing your response and gathering your input.